Nathaniel Calloway didn't like being summoned. And yet, there he was, sitting in a high-backed leather chair in his grandfather's lawyer's office, listening to the terms of the will that would decide the fate of his empire. "You have 6 months to marry," the lawyer, Theodore Graves, stated, adjusting his glasses. "Otherwise, the entirety of Calloway Enterprises, including the inheritance your grandfather left, will be transferred to the Calloway Foundation under the board's control." Nate's jaw tightened. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished mahogany table. "You can't be serious." Graves slid a copy of the will across the table. "It's all there, in black and white. Your grandfather wanted you to understand responsibility, not just in business, but in life. He believed marriage would save me." Nate's voice was sharp. "Teach me the value of love? Spare me the sentimentality. He ran this company like a battlefield, and now you're telling me his last act was playing matchmaker?" Graves sighed. "You know your grandfather. He never did anything without purpose. The will states you must be married for at least a year. Divorce or annulment before that period will void your claim." Nate exhaled slowly, his hands clenching. 6 months to find a wife. A year trapped in a marriage he didn't want. All to satisfy a man who was no longer even alive to watch it play out. "This is ridiculous. It's binding." His mind calculated every possible loophole. There had to be one. He was Nathaniel Calloway, for God's sake. He had built his own fortune within his grandfather's empire, turned millions into billions, crushed competitors without hesitation. Marriage was an inconvenience, a contract he'd rather not sign. But losing everything? That wasn't an option. He rose from his chair, buttoning his suit jacket with an air of finality. "Fine. I'll find someone." Graves raised an eyebrow. "A real marriage, Nathaniel, not some staged affair. If the board suspects fraud, they won't." His voice was ice. "I'll handle it." Without another word, he turned and walked out, already calculating his next move. Ivy Munro's fingers trembled as she looked at the eviction notice on the kitchen table. Past due bills were stacked beside it, an avalanche of debt she had no way to stop. "Mom?" Her younger sister, Lacey, peeked around the corner, her dark eyes filled with uncertainty. Ivy forced a smile. "Everything's fine, sweetheart." Lacey hesitated before nodding, disappearing back into the small bedroom they shared in their rundown Houston apartment. Ivy closed her eyes. She needed a miracle. Her phone buzzed. A number she didn't recognize. She hesitated, then answered. "Hello? Ivy Monroe?" The voice on the other end was professional, clipped. "Yes? My name is Thomas Wright. I represent Mr. Nathaniel Calloway. He would like to discuss an opportunity with you. Can you meet tomorrow morning at Calloway Tower?" Ivy nearly dropped the phone. Nathaniel Calloway? The billionaire? The man whose name was on half the skyscrapers in Houston? She cleared her throat. "Why would Nathaniel Calloway want to meet me? That will be discussed in person." It sounded like a scam, but Ivy didn't have the luxury of ignoring strange calls. "Okay," she said, gripping the phone tighter. "I'll be there." The next morning, Ivy sat in a glass-walled office on the 60th floor of Calloway Tower. Everything smelled of wealth. Leather, polished wood, coffee so expensive it probably came from another planet. And then he walked in. Nathaniel Calloway was taller than she expected. Sharply dressed, powerful, cold. The kind of man who didn't waste words. He sat across from her, steepling his fingers. "Miss Monroe." Ivy straightened her spine, feeling acutely aware of her cheap blouse and scuffed shoes. "Mr. Calloway." "I'll get to the point." His blue eyes locked onto hers. "I need a wife." The words hung in the air like a gunshot. Ivy blinked. "Excuse me?" "A contract marriage. 1 year. No expectations beyond the arrangement itself. In exchange, I'll settle your debts, provide financial stability for your family, and compensate you handsomely." She stared at him. "You want to pay me to marry you?" He didn't blink. "Yes." Everything inside her screamed run. This was insane. Unreal. But then she thought of Lacey, of the eviction notice, of the life she was fighting so hard to hold together. She swallowed hard. "Why me?" "Because you have no connection to my world. You aren't a socialite or an heiress. There's no emotional complication. It's simple. Her stomach twisted. Simple. Right. Just like selling her soul. What happens after a year? You walk away. Debt-free. Wealthy. No strings. Ivy exhaled shakily. This was wrong. But losing everything would be worse. She lifted her chin. Fine. I'll do it. Nate's gaze didn't waver. Good. He slid a thick folder toward her. Read it carefully. The wedding is in 2 weeks. Her fingers hesitated before taking the contract. 2 weeks. And then she would become Ivy Calloway. She had no idea what she was getting herself into. Ivy sat in the back seat of the black luxury car, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, the engagement ring on her finger. Large, cold, impersonal, felt like a shackle. Outside, Houston blurred past in streaks of neon and glass, but inside the car, everything was still. Suffocating. She had barely spoken to Nathaniel Calloway since signing the contract. He had handled everything. The paperwork, the media control, even the dress fittings. She had been fitted for a designer gown she never would have chosen, had her hair styled by a team who barely acknowledged her presence, and was now being transported to a wedding she still didn't believe was happening. 2 weeks ago, she had been drowning in debt. Now she was about to become a billionaire's wife. And yet, she had never felt more powerless. The car pulled up to a towering cathedral in the heart of the city, surrounded by press. Camera flashes ignited like firecrackers as Ivy's door swung open. The driver extended a hand, but she hesitated before stepping out. You don't have to be afraid. Nathaniel's voice startled her. She turned to find him already outside, standing tall in a tailored black tuxedo, his expression unreadable. He didn't offer his arm, didn't fake warmth, just regarded her with that cool, assessing gaze. I'm not afraid, she said, though her voice betrayed her. His lips twitched, just barely. Then let's get this over with. Inside, the church was nearly empty. No family, no friends, just a handful of powerful business associates and board members who were here for one reason: to witness the marriage that would secure Nathaniel's inheritance. Ivy barely heard the officiant. Every vow she repeated felt hollow, meaningless. The moment Nate slid the wedding band onto her finger, a strange finality settled over her. It was done. She was legally Ivy Calloway. You may kiss the bride, the officiant announced. Ivy froze. Nate hesitated just a fraction before leaning in. His lips brushed hers. Not a kiss, just the ghost of one. A performance for the few watching. But even that brief contact sent a jolt through her. Then it was over. A handshake would have been more intimate. The reception was as cold as the ceremony. It was held at an exclusive 5-star hotel, but it felt more like a business conference than a wedding celebration. Ivy stood beside Nate, accepting congratulations from strangers who barely looked at her. A marriage of convenience, she heard someone murmur behind her. Smart move on his part. She's nothing special, but at least she's unproblematic. Ivy's stomach turned. She looked up at Nate, expecting to see some reaction, but his face was impassive. Did he hear them? Did he care? Before she could dwell on it, his hand pressed against her lower back, a silent command. Time to go, he murmured. She stiffened but followed him through the crowd, nodding at well-wishers who didn't mean it. The penthouse was vast and silent. Ivy stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the Houston skyline, feeling like a trespasser. Nate had disappeared into another room, but now he returned, having shed his tuxedo jacket and loosened his tie. He looked at her for a long moment before finally speaking. You'll have your own room. She exhaled, shoulders sagging with relief. She hadn't let herself think about what might happen tonight, but hearing it laid out so plainly sent a strange mix of emotions through her. This isn't a real marriage, Ivy, he continued. I won't expect anything from you, and I don't want you expecting anything from me. His voice was even, distant. She should have been grateful for that distance, but for some reason, it stung. I understand, she said. Nate nodded once. Then, to her surprise, he stepped closer. He reached for her hand, the one with the wedding ring, and for a brief moment, she thought, what is he doing? Then he did something she never expected. He knelt in front of her. Ivy's breath caught. Nate Calloway, a man who commanded empires, who never bent for anyone, was on one knee before her. Not in reverence, not in devotion, but with something else entirely in his eyes. "I don't love you," he said, "and I never will." His fingers grazed the back of her hand, so lightly it could have been an accident. "But I'll respect the agreement." His voice was softer now. "I won't touch you. I won't interfere in your life. In a year, you'll leave this marriage with everything you were promised." Ivy couldn't breathe. Then, just as quickly as he had knelt, he stood, his expression once again unreadable. "Good night, Ivy." And then he walked away, leaving her alone with a ring she never wanted, in a marriage that felt more like a prison than a promise. The silence in the penthouse was suffocating. Ivy had expected some level of discomfort in this arrangement, but the reality of it was far colder than she'd anticipated. She and Nate were strangers, bound by legal documents and a mutual understanding that their marriage was nothing more than a transaction. Days passed with little interaction. He left early in the morning, returning late at night. Their paths rarely crossed, and when they did, their conversations were clipped, perfunctory. "Your credit card is activated," Nate had told her one evening, standing by the door as he adjusted his cufflinks. "Use it for whatever you need." She had nodded, unsure of what to say. What did one say to a man who had bought her presence but not her company? On the fourth day of their marriage, Ivy decided she couldn't spend another second confined to the penthouse. She ventured outside, wandering through the high-end boutiques and cafes of the city. People stared. Some whispered. It wasn't lost on her that she was Ivy Calloway now, a name that meant something to strangers but felt foreign on her own lips. She stopped at a coffee shop, ordering a drink she normally wouldn't splurge on. As she stood by the counter, scrolling absent-mindedly through her phone, she felt a presence beside her. "You must be Mrs. Calloway." The voice was smooth, amused. Ivy turned to find a man in his mid-30s, impeccably dressed, watching her with interest. "That's not my name," she said instinctively. His smile widened. "Funny. That's not what the papers say." Ivy frowned. "Who are you?" "James Harrington, business associate of your husband." He extended a hand, which she reluctantly shook. "And you are the woman who, 2 weeks ago, didn't exist in his world." Quite the mystery, really. Ivy stiffened. "I don't know what you mean." "Oh, I think you do." He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Let me guess. A quiet little arrangement? You keep your head down, play the role, and after a year, you walk away with a fortune?" Her pulse quickened. James chuckled. "Relax. I'm not here to expose you. I just find it interesting. Nathaniel doesn't do attachments. He doesn't even pretend to." She wanted to walk away, but something about James made her pause. There was something almost too knowing in his eyes. "Why do you care?" she asked carefully. "Because men like Nathaniel don't change overnight. And yet, here you are, his charming, unsuspecting wife." He tilted his head. "Unless, of course, you're not unsuspecting at all." Ivy's fingers tightened around her cup. "I don't know what you think you know, but my marriage is none of your business." "Of course not." His smile remained. "But if you ever feel like you're in over your head, remember this conversation." With that, he turned and walked away. Ivy exhaled, her heart hammering. She had known people would question her sudden presence in Nate's life. But something about James Harrington's words unsettled her in a way she couldn't explain. That night, Ivy found Nate in the penthouse's study, seated behind a massive desk, scanning through reports on his laptop. "You should have told me people would be watching me," she said, stepping inside. Nate didn't look up. "That should have been obvious." "I ran into James Harrington today," she continued. "That got his attention." He closed his laptop, his expression sharpening. "What did he say?" "Enough to make it clear he suspects this isn't real." She crossed her arms. "You do realize I'm the one dealing with questions, right? Maybe you should have given me a heads up before throwing me into the deep end." Nate leaned back in his chair, regarding her with quiet intensity. "Harrington is always looking for weaknesses. He likes to stir trouble where he can. Don't engage with him." "That's your only advice? Ignore him?" "Yes." His tone was final. Ivy scoffed. "You really don't care how this affects me, do you?" His eyes narrowed slightly. You knew what this was when you agreed to it. Her stomach twisted. Right. A business deal. No complications. Exactly. She should have left it at that. But something in her rebelled against the cold dismissal. You know, I don't think you actually hate people, she said. I think you just decided a long time ago that caring was a waste of time. His jaw tightened. You don't know me. No, she admitted. But maybe that's the problem. For a second, just a second, she thought she saw something flicker in his gaze. But then it was gone, replaced by the same impassive mask he always wore. Stay out of things that don't concern you, Ivy, he said simply. Then, just like always, he walked away, leaving her alone in a marriage where silence was the loudest thing of all. Ivy was beginning to understand something about Nathaniel Calloway. He wasn't just indifferent. He was untouchable. No matter what she said or did, he remained locked behind a wall she couldn't breach. Their marriage was a carefully constructed performance, one that existed only on paper and in the public eye. Behind closed doors, they lived in separate worlds, orbiting the same space without ever colliding. Until tonight. Tonight, she finally saw the first crack in the ice. Ivy had trouble sleeping in the penthouse. It wasn't the size, though the place was obscenely large. It was the unfamiliarity, the cold, impersonal luxury, the silence so absolute it felt unnatural. And then there was him. Every night, she heard Nate return home, sometimes past midnight, other times even later. His footsteps were always measured, his movements precise. She could almost picture him walking in, loosening his tie, pouring himself a drink before disappearing into whatever part of the penthouse he claimed as his own. She told herself she didn't care. But tonight, something was different. The sound of breaking glass shattered the stillness. Ivy bolted upright in bed, heart pounding. She hesitated only a moment before throwing off the covers and stepping into the hallway. The penthouse was dimly lit, the city skyline stretching endlessly beyond the windows. She found him in the study. Nate stood near his desk, breathing heavily, his fist clenched. A shattered whiskey glass lay at his feet, amber liquid pooling across the floor. His tie was undone, the first few buttons of his dress shirt unfastened, just enough to reveal tension in his shoulders, the tightness in his chest. He didn't acknowledge her. For a moment, she considered leaving, walking away like he always did. But then she saw something that made her stay. His hands were shaking. It was barely noticeable, but it was there, the slightest tremor in his fingers. Whatever had happened tonight, it had gotten to him. Ivy took a careful step forward. Are you okay? Nate exhaled sharply, tilting his head back as if trying to pull himself together. Go back to bed, Ivy. She ignored the command. What happened? It doesn't concern you. His voice was controlled, but not as steady as usual. She crossed her arms. You broke a glass and look like you're about to punch a hole in the wall. I'd say that concerns someone. His jaw clenched. Silence stretched between them. Then, unexpectedly, he let out a low, humorless laugh. You don't give up, do you? No, she admitted. He shook his head, running a hand over his face. The exhaustion was evident now. Not just physical, but something deeper. Something that made his edges sharper, his presence heavier. Ivy waited. And then, he spoke. I had a meeting with the board tonight, he said finally. They think I'm distracted. That this marriage is making me weak. She blinked. Because you got married? Because I didn't marry the kind of woman they expected. His gaze locked onto hers. They think you're a liability. Something cold settled in her chest. I see, she murmured. So, what? They don't like that I wasn't born into their world. Nate's expression didn't change. They don't believe I would marry someone like you unless I was desperate. Ouch. Ivy swallowed down the sting. She shouldn't have been surprised. She had already overheard whispers about her, already felt the weight of scrutiny in every interaction. But hearing it from him? That hurt more than she wanted to admit. And what do you believe? She asked, her voice quieter now. For the first time, he hesitated. She saw it, the flicker of something unspoken in his gaze. But just as quickly as it appeared, he buried it beneath his usual indifference. It doesn't matter what I believe, he said. The board controls more than they should. If they decide I'm compromised, they'll come for my position. Ivy frowned. You own the company. I own the majority, he corrected. But they can make my life hell if they want to. Something about the way he said it made her stomach twist. She had assumed Nate was untouchable, that his power was absolute. But now she saw the truth. He wasn't just fighting for control. He was holding onto it with both hands. And people were waiting for him to fail. She took a slow breath. So what do we do? His brows lifted slightly. We? Well, unless you plan on divorcing me tomorrow. I'm part of this now, she said, meeting his gaze. Like it or not. His lips pressed together, as if he wanted to argue. But then something shifted. He studied her, really studied her, like he was seeing her for the first time. And then, he nodded. We make them believe, he said simply. Ivy exhaled, relief washing over her. Not because she was invested in this ridiculous arrangement, but because, for the first time since they'd gotten married, Nate wasn't treating her like an outsider. For the first time, he wasn't shutting her out. It wasn't much, but it was something. Later that night, Ivy lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. She didn't know why, but her conversation with Nate replayed in her mind over and over. She should have felt insulted, angry, frustrated. But instead, all she felt was curiosity. Because tonight, Nathaniel Calloway had let the mask slip, and Ivy Monroe was starting to wonder what else was hidden underneath. The first time Ivy Monroe Calloway attended an event as Mrs. Calloway, she realized exactly how brutal Nate's world could be. The gala was a high-profile charity event, hosted by one of the many elite families of Houston, and attendance was mandatory, not for charity, but for power. The city's wealthiest and most influential gathered in one place, hidden behind designer gowns and tuxedos, drinking champagne while making silent calculations about who was rising and who was falling. It wasn't just an event. It was a battlefield. And tonight, Ivy was walking straight into enemy territory. As soon as they stepped onto the red carpet, the cameras swarmed. Nate, over here. Mr. Calloway, how does married life feel? Ivy, give us a smile. The flashing lights were blinding. Nate's grip on her waist was firm, guiding her forward without hesitation. He didn't pause, didn't react. This was routine for him. For Ivy, it was overwhelming. The reporters' voices blended together. Speculation, scrutiny, doubt. She looks nervous. Not his usual type. How long do you think this one will last? Ivy kept her head high, refusing to let the whispers get to her. She had spent years surviving on nothing but grit and determination. She could survive this, too. They made it inside, and the atmosphere shifted. The noise faded into a softer hum of conversation, the scent of expensive perfume and aged whiskey filling the air. The room was stunning. Chandeliers dripping with crystals, tables adorned with floral arrangements more expensive than her old rent, champagne flowing like water. But Ivy didn't care about any of that. She cared about the people watching her. Every gaze that lingered too long, every forced smile, every hushed conversation that stopped the moment she walked past. She wasn't welcome here, and she knew it. Nathaniel, on the other hand, thrived in this world. He greeted people with measured charm, shook hands with practiced ease, navigated conversations with the kind of effortless confidence that only came from owning the room. And he expected Ivy to keep up. So she did. She smiled when introductions were made. She listened intently, even when she had no idea what billion-dollar deal was being discussed. She sipped her champagne, maintained eye contact, and played the role of the perfect wife. But then, James Harrington appeared. Ah, the newlyweds, he said smoothly, his smirk lazy, predatory. How domestic. Ivy stiffened. She felt Nate tense beside her, but his expression remained unreadable. Harrington, Nate said coolly. James's gaze flicked to Ivy, amusement dancing in his eyes. You're adjusting well, I see. I manage, she said evenly. I bet you do. His smirk widened. Must be fascinating, being married to a man who doesn't believe in love. Ivy's stomach twisted. She knew what this marriage was. Knew it was nothing more than a contract. But hearing it said out loud, like a joke, like an open secret, made her chest tighten. Before she could respond, Nate's grip on her waist tightened slightly. Harrington, he said, his tone sharper now, colder. Find another conversation. James chuckled. Of course. Wouldn't want to ruin the illusion. With one last glance at Ivy, he strolled away. She exhaled slowly. Nate's fingers lingered on her waist for a second longer before he pulled away. Ignore him. That's getting harder to do. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and for the first time that night, something in his expression softened. But before he could say anything, another voice interrupted. Ivy. She turned and felt her breath catch. Derek. He stood a few feet away, looking at her with a mixture of disbelief and something else. Something dangerously close to hurt. Her past had just walked into the room. Derek had been the closest thing to love Ivy had ever known. Before the death, before the desperation, before she became someone else's wife. And now, he was standing here, staring at her as if she had betrayed him. I didn't know you, he trailed off, glancing at Nate before looking back at her. I didn't know you were married. Ivy forced a smile, even as her pulse thundered. It was sudden. Derek's gaze searched hers, like he was looking for the truth underneath the lie. And maybe he was. Because Derek knew her. Knew the girl who worked 2 jobs to take care of her family. Knew the girl who swore she'd never become someone like this. And now? Now she was standing beside a billionaire, wearing a ring that meant nothing, pretending to be someone she wasn't. Ivy, he said softly, what are you doing? Nate's hand slid back to her waist. Not possessive, not claiming, just a reminder, a warning. Ivy lifted her chin. I'm exactly where I need to be. Derek's expression darkened, but he nodded. I see. And then he walked away. The rest of the night blurred together. The champagne tasted bitter. The room felt colder. The whispers were louder. By the time they returned to the penthouse, Ivy's shoulders ached from the weight of pretending. She kicked off her heels, exhaling sharply. Well, that was fun. Nate loosened his tie, watching her. Derek. She turned. What? You didn't mention him before. She crossed her arms. I didn't think it was relevant. He studied her, unreadable as always. It is now. Ivy scoffed. Oh, so you care now? His jaw tightened. I don't care, Ivy. I just need to know if he's a problem. He's not, she snapped. Silence. Then, to her surprise, Nate laughed, a short, humorless sound. This was your first taste of my world. She glared. Oh, I've tasted it, and I hate it. His expression didn't change. Good. Then you know why I don't waste my time caring. Ivy clenched her fists. You know what's funny? I actually believed, for a second, that you might be more than this. His gaze darkened. Then that was your mistake. She turned away before he could see the anger and the hurt on her face. And as she walked into her separate bedroom, she told herself she didn't care either. Even though they were both lying. Ivy didn't sleep that night. She stared at the ceiling of her separate bedroom, feeling like an intruder in her own life. The gala had exposed everything she had been trying to ignore. The scrutiny, the whispers, the realization that she was nothing more than a pawn in Nate's world. But worst of all, Derek had seen her. She had spent years building herself into someone strong, someone who wouldn't need saving. And yet, standing in that ballroom, looking into his eyes, she had felt like an imposter. Because deep down, she knew. The girl Derek had loved, the one who had dreamed of escaping a hard life through honest work, not deals with the devil, was gone. The next morning, Ivy avoided Nate. Not that it was hard. He had already left by the time she emerged from her room. Good. She needed space, needed to clear her head. She spent the day out, wandering through the city, trying to find something, anything, that felt normal. But nothing did. People stared when they recognized her. Some smiled politely, others whispered behind their hands. Every cafe, every boutique, every street corner felt like another reminder that she didn't belong. By the time she returned to the penthouse, exhaustion had settled deep in her bones. She wasn't even inside for a full minute before she heard his voice. Where were you? Ivy turned, startled. Nate stood in the living room, his tie loosened, his sleeves rolled up. There was something almost casual about the way he looked, but his expression was anything but. I needed air, she said, dropping her purse on the counter. Didn't know I had a curfew. Nate exhaled slowly, as if reining himself in. You can do whatever you want. But next time, tell me before you disappear all day. Ivy frowned. Why? So you can keep tabs on me? So I don't have to deal with the press calling me, asking where my wife is and whether she's already regretting our marriage. Ivy stiffened. That happened? He let out a humorless laugh. Welcome to my world, Ivy. She swallowed hard. This was the part she hadn't thought about. The constant attention. The way her every move was now dissected by people who didn't even know her. I'm sorry, she muttered. Nate studied her for a long moment. Then, instead of some sharp retort, he surprised her. I should have warned you. Her eyes snapped to his. He looked tired, the usual steel in his gaze slightly dulled. It was the closest thing to understanding she had seen from him, and for some reason, that made her more unsettled than anything else. Later that night, Ivy curled up on the couch, flipping through channels aimlessly. She was halfway through a mindless reality show when Nate appeared in the doorway. You watch this stuff? He asked, leaning against the wall. She glanced at the screen, where two contestants were screaming at each other over a ruined cake. It's mindless entertainment. I don't have to think. Nate smirked. Never took you for the type. Never took you for the type to care. He didn't respond, but instead of walking away, he crossed the room and sat down on the opposite end of the couch. Ivy blinked. Nathaniel Calloway voluntarily sitting with her? She was almost convinced she was hallucinating. What are you doing? She asked suspiciously. Expanding my cultural awareness, he said dryly, gesturing to the TV. She rolled her eyes but didn't tell him to leave. They sat in silence, watching a group of reality contestants sabotage each other's cakes. It was strangely normal. For the first time, the penthouse didn't feel like a gilded prison. For the first time, Nate didn't feel like a stranger. A few days later, Ivy found herself staring at the invitation. It was for another event, another public performance, and she didn't know if she had the energy for it. You're coming, Nate said as he adjusted his watch. She looked up at him from the breakfast bar. You're very confident in that. It's non-negotiable. Ivy sighed. And what happens if I refuse? His lips twitched slightly. Then I'll have to convince you. Her pulse flickered, but she ignored it. Fine, she muttered, grabbing the invitation. But if I have to suffer through another night with these people, you owe me. Nate raised an eyebrow. Oh. She crossed her arms. Yes, a deal. You like those, don't you? He smirked. Depends on the terms. Ivy leaned forward slightly. If I go, you owe me a real date. The amusement in his eyes faded. A date? Yes, a normal one. No press, no billionaires, no cold business transactions. Just a real, human interaction. Nate stared at her for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, he nodded. Deal. Ivy didn't know why her stomach fluttered, but she ignored that too, because this was just another transaction. Nothing more, right? Ivy had no idea what she was expecting when she made that deal with Nate. Maybe she thought he'd brush it off. Maybe she assumed he'd find some loophole to avoid it entirely. But 2 nights after yet another exhausting, image-driven gala, she walked into the living room to find Nate standing there, holding car keys. Get dressed, he said simply. She blinked. What? The date. His gaze was steady, unreadable. You said no press, no billionaires, no business. Fine. Let's go. She stared at him for a moment, trying to gauge if he was serious. He was. Nathaniel Calloway, king of contracts and transactions, was actually keeping his word. Ivy hadn't been in a car with just Nate before. Usually, it was private drivers, security details, carefully planned exits and entrances. But tonight, he drove. A sleek black Aston Martin, the engine smooth as silk, effortlessly weaving through the Houston streets. It was late, past 9, but the city still pulsed with life. The streetlights flickered against the windshield, reflecting off the sharp angles of Nate's face. He didn't speak much, one hand resting lazily on the steering wheel, the other tapping idly against the gear shift. Ivy, for once, didn't fill the silence. Because, for the first time, it wasn't uncomfortable. It just was. He didn't take her to a Michelin star restaurant. He didn't take her to a private club filled with people pretending to enjoy themselves. Instead, Nate Calloway took Ivy Monroe to a diner. An actual diner. Neon lights flickering, cracked leather booths, the smell of fresh coffee and grease lingering in the air. Ivy stared as he parked the car. "This is unexpected." Nate smirked. "You wanted normal." She shook her head, half amused, half genuinely baffled. Was this actually happening? They walked inside, and no one cared who they were. No cameras, no whispers, just the hum of an old jukebox and the sound of plates clattering in the kitchen. They slid into a booth near the window, and a tired-looking waitress with a name tag that read Margie came over. "What'll it be?" she asked, barely looking at them. Ivy grinned. This was amazing. "I'll take a cheeseburger and a chocolate shake," she said without hesitation. Margie scribbled it down, then turned to Nate. He glanced at Ivy, then back at the waitress. "Same." Ivy almost laughed. Nathaniel Calloway, billionaire, eating a greasy cheeseburger? She couldn't wait. For a while, they just ate. No formalities, no carefully measured words. Just food and silence and a small pocket of normalcy. At some point, Ivy noticed Nate watching her. Not in his usual, calculated way. This was something different. Something unreadable. "What?" she asked, wiping ketchup off her thumb. He hesitated. Then, "How did you end up here?" The question caught her off guard. "Here, as in Houston?" she asked. He shook his head. "No, here, with me." She swallowed, setting her burger down. "I think we both know the answer to that," she said lightly, trying to keep the conversation from getting too deep. But Nate wasn't letting this one go. He leaned forward slightly, forearms resting on the table. "You had other options." Ivy tensed. "Not really." "You did," he countered. "Derek, don't." Her voice came out sharper than intended. Something flickered in Nate's gaze, but he didn't press. Instead, he tilted his head slightly. "You regret it?" She let out a small, humorless laugh. "You mean marrying you?" His lips twitched. "Yes." Ivy took a deep breath, staring down at her half-eaten burger. Some days, she admitted. Honest. Simple. No point in lying. Nate was quiet for a moment. Then, "And today?" Ivy looked up, meeting his gaze. Something changed in the air. She didn't answer. Didn't need to. Because the silence was enough. The drive home was different. Lighter. Ivy found herself leaning her head against the cool glass of the window, watching the lights blur past. For the first time since this marriage started, she didn't feel like she was suffocating. For the first time, Nate Calloway didn't feel like a contract she had signed. He felt like something else entirely. And that was the most dangerous part of all. Ivy told herself the date didn't mean anything, that it was just part of the deal. A way to make the arrangement feel less suffocating, less artificial. But the problem with lies, especially the ones you tell yourself, is that they start to unravel the second you let your guard down. And Ivy had let her guard down. Now, she wasn't sure she could put it back up. The morning after the diner, Ivy woke up too aware of everything. Of the faint scent of Nate's cologne lingering in the penthouse. Of the way her body still felt light from the way he had looked at her. Of the way her chest tightened at the thought that maybe, just maybe, things between them were shifting. It was a dangerous thought. One she needed to kill before it could take root. So, she did the only thing she could think of. She went back to pretending. Pretending that she didn't feel different. Pretending that she hadn't seen something in Nate's eyes last night that terrified her. But, of course, pretending only worked if the other person played along. And Nate Calloway? He had stopped pretending. Ivy found him in the study later that day, flipping through documents, his jaw tight. "What's wrong?" she asked, before she could stop herself. Nate didn't look up. The board. Of course. The ever-present board. The faceless group of people who held far too much influence over his life. "They're questioning things again," she guessed. Nate let out a slow breath, his fingers pressing into the papers. More than usual. Ivy frowned, stepping closer. "Why?" His eyes flicked up to hers. "Because of you." Her stomach dropped. "What?" "You're unpredictable," he said simply. "You don't act the way they expect. You disappear when you want, show up when you want. They don't trust what they can't control. Ivy exhaled. Of course, Nate could fit into their world because he knew how to play their game. But her? She didn't play. She just existed, and apparently that was a problem. What do they want you to do about it? She asked, bracing herself. His lips pressed into a thin line. They want proof. She tilted her head. Of what? His gaze held hers. That we're real. Silence. Heavy. Suffocating. Ivy's throat went dry. And how exactly do you plan to prove that? Nate stood, closing the distance between them in 2 strides. For the first time, she noticed the tension in his shoulders wasn't just frustration. It was something else. Something dangerous. Something she wasn't ready for. His voice was quiet when he spoke. What do you think, Ivy? The way he said her name sent a shiver through her spine. She took a step back. Nate. His eyes darkened. Tell me to stop. She couldn't. Or maybe she just wouldn't. Because deep down, this was what she had been running from. Not the marriage. Not the board. Him. The way he made her feel like she was teetering on the edge of something she couldn't come back from. The way she knew, without a doubt, that if she let him in, truly let him in, she'd be ruined. But she didn't move. Didn't want to move. And Nate saw it. His fingers brushed against her jaw, soft, barely there. But enough to make her entire body tense. Enough to make her want. This is dangerous, she whispered. His lips tilted into something unreadable. I know. And yet, neither of them pulled away. They were standing at the edge of a line neither of them should cross. But for the first time, Ivy wasn't sure she wanted to stay on the right side of it. Because with Nathaniel Calloway, falling felt inevitable. Ivy hadn't been able to stop thinking about that moment. The way Nate had looked at her. The way the air between them had shifted. The way she had let herself get too close to something she wasn't supposed to want. She had spent so much time convincing herself that this marriage was just a deal, a business arrangement with an expiration date. But then he had touched her. Not out of obligation. Not for the cameras. Because he wanted to. And the worst part? She had wanted him to. For the next few days, Ivy avoided him. She told herself she was just being practical. That distance was the best way to reset whatever the hell had almost happened between them. But avoiding Nate Calloway was nearly impossible when they lived in the same penthouse. And when he finally cornered her, she knew there was no more running. She had just stepped out of her bedroom when she found him waiting in the hallway. Are we going to talk about it? He asked. Ivy exhaled sharply, already regretting leaving her room at all. There's nothing to talk about. His eyes flickered. Liar. She pushed past him, heading toward the kitchen. Of course he followed. Ivy. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. She opened the fridge, pretending to search for something. I'm not doing this, Nate. You already are. She slammed the door shut. What do you want me to say? He stepped closer. I want you to stop pretending. Her pulse kicked up. Pretending what? That you don't feel it. His voice was low, steady, dangerous. That you don't feel this. Ivy clenched her fists. He wasn't supposed to say it. If he said it, she couldn't ignore it. So she did the only thing she could. She went on the attack. This isn't real, Nate. Her voice came out sharper than intended. This was never supposed to be real. Something flickered in his expression. Something dark and unreadable. And then, before she could process it, he laughed. A short, humorless sound. Right. He nodded slowly, stepping back. Because you don't do real, do you? Her stomach twisted. What the hell is that supposed to mean? Nate tilted his head. You hide behind this act like you don't care. But I see you, Ivy. She swallowed hard. Too close. Too close. You don't see anything, she said quietly. His jaw tensed. I see more than you want me to. The tension in the room was suffocating. Say something. Walk away. But she couldn't. Because for all the ways she wanted to deny it, he was right. He saw the way she had stopped pretending. The way she had started caring about him. About this marriage. About the life she swore she didn't want. And that terrified her. Because caring meant losing. And she couldn't afford to lose again. That night, Ivy lay awake in bed. She stared at the ceiling, listening to the quiet sounds of the penthouse. Somewhere in the distance, she heard Nate moving. The sound of a door closing. The faint clink of glass against marble. She shouldn't have followed. She shouldn't have cared. But she did. And that was her first mistake. The study was dimly lit when she stepped inside. Nate sat on the couch, a glass of whiskey in his hand, his tie loosened. He didn't look at her right away, but he didn't tell her to leave either. She hesitated before stepping closer. Couldn't sleep? His fingers tightened around the glass.
No.
Silence stretched between them. Then, finally, he looked up, and Ivy felt her entire world tilt. Because for the first time since this marriage began, Nathaniel Calloway looked vulnerable. And that was more dangerous than anything else. Ivy had seen Nate in many forms. The ruthless businessman, the untouchable billionaire, the man who knew how to command a room with a single glance. But she had never seen him like this, sitting in the dimly lit study, tie loosened, whiskey untouched, looking at her as if she was the only person who could hurt him. And that scared her, because she didn't want that kind of power. She didn't want to be another person who could let him down. But still, she stepped forward. Still, she let herself care. "I didn't think you drank alone," she said, voice softer than she intended. Nate let out a short breath. "I don't." And yet, the glass sat in his hand, the amber liquid barely touched. Ivy hesitated. "Want to tell me what's going on?" His jaw tightened.
No.
She wasn't surprised. Nathaniel Calloway was a fortress, a man built on control and distance, and whatever was bothering him, it was something he didn't want to share. But Ivy was done letting him push her away, so she walked over, settling onto the couch across from him. "You're staring," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. She tilted her head. "You look like a man who lost a battle." Nate huffed a quiet laugh, but it wasn't amused. He downed the rest of his whiskey, setting the glass on the table with a little more force than necessary. "The board called a meeting," he finally said. Ivy frowned.
And
they've decided they don't trust me." Her stomach twisted. "Because of me?" He didn't answer. He didn't have to. Ivy exhaled. "So, what happens now?" His eyes flicked to hers, sharp and assessing. "I handle it." She wanted to ask how, wanted to push, but she could see it. The exhaustion, the weight pressing against his shoulders. And for the first time, she realized that despite everything, despite his power, his fortune, Nate was fighting to keep control, not just of his company, of himself. And she hated that she cared, hated that she wanted to ease some of that weight. So instead of asking more questions, she did something she never thought she would do. She reached out and placed her hand over his. Nate stilled. His fingers twitched under hers, as if he wasn't used to someone touching him without an agenda. He didn't pull away, but he didn't lean in, either. Instead, he stared at her, like she was a puzzle he couldn't figure out. And maybe she was, because even she didn't know what she was doing anymore. The next morning, Ivy woke up with a sense of unease. She and Nate hadn't talked about what happened in the study, but the air between them felt different, charged, like they were on the edge of something neither of them wanted to name. So when her phone rang, she grabbed it gratefully, anything to break the silence in her own head. She didn't recognize the number, but the second she answered, everything in her body went cold. "Hello, Ivy." She hadn't heard that voice in years. She thought she never would again. She gripped the phone tighter. "What do you want?" A low chuckle. "Now, is that any way to greet your father?" Ivy's stomach twisted. No, not now. Not when she was barely holding herself together. "You shouldn't be calling me," she said, voice ice cold. Her father sighed dramatically. "Come on now, sweetheart. No need to be so hostile." Ivy clenched her jaw. "Cut the crap. What do you want?" Silence. Then, "I need money." Of course he did. It was always about money. Always about what she could give, not what he had already taken. Ivy's fingers dug into her palm. "I don't owe you anything." Her father scared. "That's not very kind of you, considering I'm the reason you're where you are now." Her breath caught. "Excuse me?" He chuckled. "Come on, Ivy. You really think that billionaire husband of yours just picked you out of nowhere?" Ice crawled down her spine. "What the hell are you talking about?" A pause. Then, with a smirk in his voice, he said, Ask Nate. The line went dead. Ivy lowered the phone slowly, her pulse hammering. No, Nate wouldn't. Would he? She stormed into his office without knocking. Nate looked up from his laptop, brow furrowing. Something wrong? She threw her phone onto his desk. My father just called me. His expression didn't change, didn't even flicker. And that was all the confirmation she needed. Oh my God. She took a step back. It's true. Nate's eyes darkened. What did he tell you? Her stomach twisted. Enough. Silence stretched between them. Then, finally, Nate sighed, leaning back in his chair. Ivy. No, she snapped. Don't you dare try to justify this. His jaw tightened. I wasn't going to. She shook her head. You knew. Before we even met. You. She swallowed, forcing herself to breathe. You chose me because of him, didn't you? Nate's silence was deafening. And that was her breaking point. Because whatever this was, this fragile, almost something between them, it had been built on a lie. Ivy's throat tightened. I was starting to think you weren't as cold as everyone says you are. Nate exhaled slowly, his voice almost too soft when he said, Ivy? She shook her head. I guess they were right. And then, before she could see whatever was in his expression, before she could start doubting her own pain, she turned and walked away. For the first time, truly regretting ever saying yes. Ivy didn't stop walking. She didn't stop when Nate called after her. Didn't stop when she stepped into her bedroom, shutting the door with more force than necessary. She just kept moving, pacing the length of the room, heart hammering against her ribs. She couldn't believe it. She wouldn't believe it, except she had heard it in his silence. Her father, the man who had abandoned her, used her, left her to pick up the pieces, had been involved in this marriage. And Nate? Nate had known. A knock at the door. She ignored it. Another knock. Firmer this time. Ivy. His voice was steady, calm. Too calm. Like he knew she was unraveling and was waiting for the right moment to step in. She clenched her jaw. Not this time. The door opened, and Nate stepped inside. She spun to face him. I didn't say you could come in. He shut the door behind him. Didn't think I needed permission. Ivy let out a sharp breath. Oh, so this is how it is? You get caught in a lie, and now I don't even get a locked door? Nate's eyes darkened. It's not a lie. She let out a humorless laugh. Oh, so you're admitting it now? Silence. Ivy's chest tightened. You knew my father was a piece of shit. You knew he would do anything for money. And yet, you still went to him, didn't you? His jaw tensed. I didn't go to him. Her pulse kicked up. Then explain. He exhaled slowly, as if choosing his words carefully. Your father was in debt, bad debt. The kind that doesn't just go away. Ivy's stomach twisted. She knew that. Of course, she knew that. It was the reason she had worked herself to the bone for years. The reason she had taken on his burdens as her own. The reason she had agreed to this marriage in the first place. I already knew he owed people money, she said, voice tight. That doesn't explain how he's connected to you. Nate held her gaze. Because when the people he owed came knocking, he tried to sell them a better deal. Her breath caught. What deal? He promised them something more valuable than his own debt. She swallowed. What? Nate's voice was quieter now. You. The room tilted. She shook her head. No. That's no. But she knew it was true. She knew her father would sell anyone if it meant saving himself. She had just never let herself admit it. Ivy forced herself to breathe. And you? What was your role in all of this? Nate's expression remained unreadable. Your father didn't come to me. He went to someone on the board. The deal was simple. If I married you, the debt disappeared. Ivy clenched her fists. And you just went along with it? Nate's gaze sharpened. You think I liked being manipulated? She let out a bitter laugh. Oh, poor you, Nate. Must be awful to be trapped in a billion-dollar empire. His eyes flashed. You think this is easy? God, you are unbelievable. She turned away, pressing her hands to her temples. I don't even know why I'm surprised. I should have known. Of course, you wouldn't have picked me. Silence. She expected him to argue. Expected him to deny it. But he didn't. And that That hurt more than anything else. She exhaled shakily, keeping her back to him. I was starting to believe this marriage wasn't the worst thing that ever happened to me. His voice was quiet. And now? She swallowed hard. Now I know it was just another mistake. Another betrayal. Another illusion. Nate didn't try to stop her when she packed a bag. Didn't say a word when she threw some clothes inside, grabbing whatever she could without thinking. She could feel his presence behind her, watching, waiting, but not stopping her. She zipped the bag and turned. I'm leaving. His face was unreadable. Where are you going? She shook her head. It doesn't matter. He took a step closer. It does. Ivy clenched her jaw. He didn't get to act like he cared. Not now. I need space, Nate. His hands curled into fists. For how long? She exhaled. I don't know. A muscle in his jaw twitched. She waited. Waited for him to fight for her. But he didn't. And that was her final answer. The night was cold when she stepped outside. She tightened her coat around herself, staring at the city lights stretching beyond the skyline. She had no idea where she was going. No idea what came next. But she knew one thing. She couldn't stay. Not when every second in that penthouse was a reminder of the truth. That Nathaniel Calloway had never really chosen her. Not the way she had started to choose him. And that was something she couldn't forgive. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Ivy didn't cry. Not when she left the penthouse. Not when the cold air bit at her skin. Not when she checked into a hotel under a different name just to get some space to think. She didn't cry because this wasn't heartbreak. It was a lesson. She should have known better. She should have kept her guard up. Because in the end, she had been nothing more than a deal. A transaction that never really belonged to her. And now, she had to figure out who she was without him. Days passed. She ignored Nate's calls. Ignored the texts. Ignored everything except the one thing that mattered. What came next? Because if she wasn't Mrs. Calloway, then who was she? She spent the first few days in her hotel, staring out at the city skyline, trying to remember the version of herself who had survived before Nate. Before the penthouse. Before the stolen glances and unspoken words. Before she let herself believe in something that was never real. And the worst part? She missed him. Even when she didn't want to. Even when she knew she shouldn't. Because Nate had made her feel. And now, without him, she wasn't sure what to do with all that empty space. By the end of the week, she had a plan. A real plan. No more running. No more hiding. She was going to get her own place. Start fresh. Because she refused to be another woman left in the shadow of Nathaniel Calloway. So when she finally stepped outside, ready to take control of her life again, she didn't expect to find him waiting, leaning against his car, hands in his pockets, eyes locked on hers. She froze. What are you doing here? Nate pushed off the car, stepping toward her. You wouldn't answer my calls. Ivy exhaled sharply. Take the hint, Nate. He didn't move. Didn't even blink. I need to talk to you, he said. She shook her head. There's nothing left to say. There is. His voice was calm. Too calm. And you're going to listen. She clenched her jaw. Why? So you can convince me that none of it mattered? That this was all just part of your perfectly calculated plan? His eyes flickered. No. Then what? She threw her hands up. What could you possibly say that would make this better? Nate exhaled slowly. I didn't choose you because of your father. Ivy scoffed. That's rich, coming from the man who... I chose you, he said, firmer this time. Because I saw you. She stilled. His voice dropped, softer now. I saw you before I ever met him. Before I knew anything about your past. She swallowed. That doesn't change the fact that you let me believe otherwise. His jaw tensed. I know. Silence stretched between them. Then, finally, he said, I made a mistake. Ivy let out a short, bitter laugh. That's one way to put it. I should have told you everything from the beginning, he admitted. I should have trusted you with the truth. Her throat tightened. Why didn't you? Nate hesitated. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, because I didn't know how to want you and still let you go. Ivy's breath caught. Damn him. Damn him for saying the one thing that could break her. Because this wasn't about the deal anymore. Wasn't about the contract. Wasn't about money or power or control. It was about them, and the choice they both had to make. She stepped closer. If I walk away, will you let me? His gaze locked onto hers.
No.
Her pulse skipped. And if I stay? Nate didn't blink. If you stay, he said, voice steady, unshakable, then I'll spend the rest of my life proving that I chose you long before you ever chose me. Ivy exhaled. Everything in her screamed run. Run before he could break her again. Run before she fell even harder. But instead, she stayed. Because for the first time since this marriage began, she wasn't choosing money. She wasn't choosing survival. She was choosing him. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough.